started here. Looks like we have 61 people attending for now. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this special roundtable discussion on the Israel-Gaza war. My name is Ryan Szpiech, and I am the director of the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies here at the University of Michigan. And I'm pleased to introduce our event today, entitled The Israel-Gaza War, the Day After. Our Zoom panelists this afternoon include, in alphabetical order, Shai Feldman, who's the Raymond Frankel Professor in Israeli Politics and Society at Brandeis University in Boston, where he's also founding director of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies. Khalil Shikaki, who is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in Ramallah. And our moderator today will be Mark Tessler at the University of Michigan, who is Samuel J. Eldersveld Professor in the Department of Political Science here at Michigan. This event is funded and hosted by the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies and by the International Institute here at the University of Michigan. I wish to thank my colleagues here in CMENAS, Jennifer and Natasha, who helped organize this event, as well as Mary Gallagher, director of the International Institute, for helping to put this event together on such short notice. Before beginning, I wish to note that CMENAS at Michigan draws its support from a Title VI grant from the U.S. Department of Education, which designates it as a National Resource Center. So as stewards of public resources, we at CMENAS make every effort to organize events like these, public, balanced, nonpartisan, open forum discussions and events to disseminate ideas and promote understanding of the important issues in the region of the Middle East and North Africa. There are, of course, many things going on across this region today, from earthquake recovery in Morocco to flood recovery in Libya to the refugee crisis in Tunisia and the southern Mediterranean, or even to Turkey's muted celebration of its 100-year anniversary as a republic. But of course, none of these are on our minds more than the explosion of violence between Gaza and Israel, the ramifications of which in so many different areas are still being discerned and discussed. The situation is not simple, and words here are not easy to find today. And while we all may have a personal response to this situation, we're not here today to offer necessarily words of sympathy and less words of political solidarity in the face of this tragedy. Then we are here to learn and understand what we can do and understand about all aspects of this situation, and to debate the ramifications and significance of the events as they're unfolding. So as we begin, I'd like to say that CMENAS and the University of Michigan here strive to always create a truly open forum for discussion in which diverse opinions can be expressed, respectfully heard, and debated. The format today will be as follows. Each speaker will be invited to make a few remarks individually, and then Dr. Tessler will lead the speakers in a conversation, followed by an open question and answer period. So I'll be collecting questions during the round table in the Q&A function in the webinar, where you can submit them, which is at the bottom of your screen. I'll try to sort of parse these, and we'll respond to as many as we can in the last half hour or so. Please note, we probably won't get through, if there are a lot, we won't get through all of them, but we'll do our best. And we'll be moderating them as they come in. And everyone can note that the discussion today is being recorded. So briefly, I will take the pleasure of introducing our moderator, Mark Tessler, who specializes in comparative politics and Middle East studies here at the University of Michigan, and for decades has studied and conducted field research in Morocco, Palestine, across North Africa, and including Gaza. So everywhere from Morocco to Palestine and beyond. And many of Professor Tessler's scholarly publications examine the nature, determinants, and political implications of attitudes and values held by ordinary citizens across the Middle East. And his publications reflect this work that he's done. He's the co-founder and co-director of the Arab Barometer Survey Project, which by 2022 has carried out 68 or more surveys across 15 countries in the region, conducting face-to-face interviews with more than 100,000 ordinary citizens in the Middle East, and has scores of publications on this material, which I won't read to you, but mentioned that among his 16 or more books, a few highlights include, most recently, Religious Minorities in Non-Secular Middle Eastern and North African States in 2020, Islam and Politics in the Middle East, Explaining the Views of Ordinary Citizens, a 2015 book supported by a Carnegie Endowment, and most recently, Social Science Research in the Arab World and Beyond, a guide for students, instructors, and researchers. And also, in 1994 and again in 2009, a history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be able to welcome all of our panelists today. And I'd like to invite Professor Mark Tessler to now introduce the panelists and moderate as he sees fit. Go ahead, Mark.
Thanks, Ryan. Let me say just a little bit more about our panelists. We're really lucky to have two outstanding experts. I've had the pleasure of knowing both of them and the pleasure of welcoming them to Michigan previously. So Dr. Khalil Shikaki, he's really leading, I think perhaps the leading Palestinian political scientist. He's also known as one of the leading pollsters, which he certainly is. He has been and is an important partner in the Arab Barometer, not only carrying out surveys in Palestine, but really helping us to get started and establish the Arab Barometer in the first place. He is director then of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, as Ryan said, based in Ramallah. He's come from there very recently. He came after the 7th of October, so he was there during the events that we're seeing now. He's definitely an expert. He's widely contacted for consultation. As a matter of fact, he came here from Washington, which was a trip added on to his schedule because of some invitations. He had a meeting with officials at the State Department and also at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He's the author of a number of books, one of which maybe I'll mention two of them. One is Palestinian and Israeli Survey Opinion. This is a work he carried out jointly with an Israeli colleague. They did joint surveys using the same questionnaire in the Palestinian territories and in Israel, and this resulted in a very nice book. Along with Shai Feldman, who I'll speak about in just a second, he's also the author or co-author, I guess, of Arabs and Israelis, Conflict and Peacemaking in the Middle East. This is a wonderful textbook, and my only objection is that people are adopting it for their classes and not adopting my also very good, hopefully, the book on the subject. But no, this is a terrific book. It had an Israeli perspective, a Palestinian perspective, and also an Egyptian perspective. Abdulmonem Said was also one of the co-authors. So we're really fortunate to have Khalil. He's a longtime friend. The same for Shai. Shai has a fantastic record. As Ryan said, he is the founder and now continuing the director of the Middle East Center, the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis. He's known as an independent scholar. His work that's been widely cited is on nuclear weapons and arms control in the Middle East. That's one of his specialties, along with Israeli politics and the Arab-Israeli conflict. He and Khalil teach a course together at Brandeis. They do it every fall, or every fall if they can, and they're joined for part of the seminar by a prominent Egyptian scholar as well. So it's a very nice arrangement. Shai took a leave for 3 years from the Crown Center to be president of the Szpiech College in Israel. He was there from 2019 to 2022. It's worth noting that Szpiech College is less than 2 miles away from the Gaza border, and it's one of the areas that was very hard hit by the Hamas attacks of October 7th. He's the one that put a lot of this together, who brings Khalil and our Egyptian colleague as well to Brandeis and organizes this. He's known for scholarship. He's known for the contributions he makes through his writings, and he's known for the work of the center that's put. I get emails all the time, Shai, from programs that the Crown Center is doing. It's very impressive, and people should ask to get on your mailing list because you have a wonderful array of programs. So with that, let me just say how I think we'll proceed. We'll ask each of the participants to speak for roughly 20 minutes. If it's a little less, that's okay. And if it bleeds into 25 minutes, as sometimes tends to be the case, that's all right as well. After we've heard from both of them, and we'll ask Shai to go first, I'll invite them to make any comments to one another. Maybe Khalil would like to respond to something that Shai said, or Shai would like to respond to something that Khalil said. I'll perhaps put in a question or two myself at that point, and then we will open it up, and Ryan will read the chat and pass along some of the questions that should be discussed. I'll try to remain silent during that period, but maybe in response to the questions that come in on the chat, maybe I'll have something to say as well. So welcome to our panelists. Welcome to the 91 people who are currently logged in. We're very happy to have this program. We thank the Center for Middle East and North African Studies and the International Institute. And Shai, we'll start off with you.
Okay, can you hear me? Good. Okay, so thank you both, Mark and Ryan. And before I start, I'll just want to add one additional word of caution to what Ryan said, which is, and it follows on the thrust of his remarks. This is certainly a very particular and very sensitive time, and because it is so sensitive, I would just like to add again one half sentence to what Ryan said, which is that we're here in an academic setting. Our job is to try to explain and to assess, and maybe from time to time stick our neck out and predict, but none of this should be interpreted in any way or form as justification. We're not here to defend any policy or hopefully a party, and not to justify anything. As I said, we're here just to try to explain and assess. So that's number one. Number two is, I think we should look to where we go from here, and not dwell too much on what's going on right now, because the present is very foggy. There's a lot of uncertainty, and obviously also a lot of purposeful disinformation from all sides as to what exactly is going on an hour-to-hour basis. So I think it is, however, a good time to see how the Middle East and the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular go beyond the horrific events that we've seen, and hopefully strive towards a better future. With respect to that, I'll say one more word to which I will get back to at the end of my hopefully less than 15 minutes, is that I believe that all the participants to this conflict will undergo a significant reckoning once the fighting is over. On the Israeli side, I can say very similar to the very dramatic reckoning that Israel has seen in the aftermath of 50 years ago, in the aftermath of the 1973 war, where it was not just that the military leadership was replaced, that a few months later, the political leadership, primarily Defense Minister Dayan and Prime Minister Golda Meir, had to go, but also that the basic assumptions that drove policy between 1967 and 1973 were thoroughly re-examined, and some very important principles that guided Israeli policy were tossed aside. So it was not just a personal reckoning, but also you could call it a philosophical and definitely policy reckoning that we saw then and that I think we will see now. In Israel, and I think that's true among most of the Arab countries, the Palestinian issue for quite some time now has been relegated to a low priority. For some of these countries, clearly, in comparison, the Iran issue has assumed much greater significance. And again, if there's something that October 7th had to remind all of us, is that it was a major, major mistake to relegate the Palestinian issue to the low priority that it has in recent years. For most Israelis and most Israeli governments, since the second Intifada 23 years ago, right-wing governments that opposed a two-state solution, Hamas was a convenient, let's call it this way, it was convenient. It was, I don't want to call it a convenient partner, it was convenient to be there. And especially after Hamas took essentially control over Gaza in 2007, first of all, because it too opposed a two-state solution, just like most of the Israeli governments during the period that we're talking about. And secondly, it allowed the opponents of a two-state solution on the Israeli side to argue convincingly, compellingly, that the Palestinian Authority, as of that point, was too weak to implement any two-state solution. And so the PA was not really a partner to a two-state solution. And in any case, it could, even if you negotiated some two-state solution with the PA, it was too weak to implement such a deal over Gaza. And so basically Hamas could be tolerated as long as it could be deterred. And it could be tolerated even if deterrence, let's say, failed every few years. But the failure was, again, until October 7, you could call it in limited scope. This basically is a set of assumptions that led Israel's approach to the PA and to Hamas for at least a decade and a half. And this is history. This is all gone. This will all be gone as part of the reckoning as a result of what's happened in the last 3.5 weeks. So after the horrific massacre of October 7, Israel launched a campaign to eradicate Hamas as a fighting force and as a governing entity. How long this campaign will last, I don't know. What shapes it will take, I also don't know. I think for all these reasons, it's even safer to try to focus on what can come after. So a few points about this. One is that not just because the stated objectives that I mentioned earlier, as defined by the Israeli government, but I would say in any case, Hamas is not going to be a partner to any, let's say, post-war future. Because no Israeli will return to the country's south, to their homes, to their schools, including the college that I headed for 3 years. As long as the guys on the other side of the border will be Hamas. Nobody would feel secure enough. Nobody will feel that he or she is personally safe enough to return to their homes to their dwellings or to their places of employment, as long as Hamas has a role in what happens on the other side of the border. But this also means, from a national point of view, that Israel will be losing sovereignty over a chunk of its pre-67 territory. So the preferences or the inability of the population to return to their homes, I think, is going to translate into a loss of sovereignty, which the government and the nation, I think, are not going to tolerate. So that's the first reason why Hamas can't be a partner. The second reason why it can't be a partner is because Hamas continues to be committed to its ideology, which basically does not accept Israel's right to exist and is committed to Israel's destruction. The PLO, we have to remember that twice in, let's say, the last 50 years, Israel, as I said, had a reckoning and changed its priorities and made a previous enemy a partner. This happened in the case of Egypt, when essentially Egypt transformed its definition of its goals from unlimited goals to limited goals. It fought the 73 war fiercely, but for limited objectives and limited goals. And the fact that President Sadat was willing to entertain the idea of accommodation with Israel became known gradually, even during the last 2 years before the 73 war. And clearly, through a number of steps, which culminated, of course, in his trip to Jerusalem, it became absolutely clear that Egypt was in for a new regime of coexistence with the state of Israel, which explains why, in contrast to everything that Israelis said between 1967 and 73, Israel, in the framework of the deal with Egypt, returned every square inch to Egyptian of land to Egypt's sovereignty. And the same with the second important turning point, which was the Oslo Accords with the PLO. Again, the Oslo Accords could not have come about, and the PLO could not have become a partner had it not gone through a process of transition beginning in 74 to the Declaration of Independence in 1988, which gradually, again, replaced the ideological commitment to come instead of Israel to a new position that looked for ways of establishing a Palestinian state side by side. Hamas has not traveled these journeys. Hamas has not traveled any of these journeys. Hamas has not adopted anything similar to the kind of process of limiting its objectives in the way that Egypt or the PLO has. So that's the second reason why I can't see how right now or in any time, unless Hamas decides to emulate the examples of Egypt and the PLO, unless that happens, I can't see how Hamas is going to be a partner. So then that begs the next question, which is, let's say that Israel is successful in eradicating Hamas's fighting power and governing capacity. Who does Israel transfer control over Gaza to? And I think that the only party that can legitimately take over Gaza is the PLO, because the PLO was supposed to have control over Gaza in the first place, because the first agreement or the first implementation agreement of the Oslo Accords was the transfer of territory first of Gaza to the PLO. And there were discussions at the time. What did Israel mean? Was it first and last? And the Israelis tried to remind and to insist that it wasn't the last, that it was just the first. There was a little tiny part of that, which is the withdrawal, also included the town of Jericho in the West Bank, just to signal that it's not just Gaza, and it's definitely not Gaza first and last. So I think we have to go back to principles, and back to principles meaning that the PLO should be the party to which Israel should transfer control over. However, I also think that the PLO cannot afford to appear to be reasserting control over Gaza behind the Israeli tanks or the Israeli aircraft and so on. So that begs the question of then what happens? And plus, we know that right now the PLO is in a very weak position. So
maybe 3 or 4 more minutes.
Sure. So I think the next the implementation, in a way, that there is a bridge that has to be crossed, and the bridge, I think, would be that some consortium of Arab countries that already have a track record of accommodation with Israel, beginning with Egypt and Jordan, and the 4 Abraham Accord states, and possibly Saudi Arabia, that was inching as their de facto leader said, every day, inch by inch, to normalization with Israel. I think these are the countries that have to assume a temporary control over Gaza in order to give time for the re-strengthening and rebuilding of the PLO. And I will end by saying this. This would require a major reckoning on the part of Israel, because Israel's entire attitude that I described in the beginning would have to change to make this happen. Israel has to once again go back to the Oslo principles that the primary partner of Israel is the PLO. And Israel has to do everything possible, everything conceivable to contribute to the strengthening of the PLO and not contribute anything. And that includes anything that includes settlement construction, that includes what the Israeli settlers in the West Bank can do or cannot do. Israel has to do everything conceivable to help, together with the other partners, strengthening the PLO. That's going to be the major Israeli contribution, in my view, to the reckoning. And with this, I will stop now.
Thanks a lot, Shai. There's a lot to follow up there. It's put a lot on the table. Khalil, maybe for another 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open things up a little bit more.
Thank you, Mark. A pleasure to be with you and Shai in this. And I'm happy to be here back at Michigan. The question of what comes next is what I want to address, and not what is unfolding right now and why it is unfolding. And there are various issues that we can address. We can talk about how the region would change or not change, and we can talk about the perception of the Arab world regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Hamas, and the wider issue of the American and Western role in all of this. I'll put this aside. If later on this issue comes up, I'm happy to talk about it. So I will restrict my day after with regard to 3 issues. One, what happens in Gaza, what happens with the domestic Palestinian environment in the aftermath, and what happens to Israeli-Palestinian relations. These are the 3 questions that I'll try in the next 15, 20 minutes, Mark, to address. On the Gaza issue, I think to a large extent, obviously we, as Shai said, we don't know how this ends. But in my view, if Israel is to achieve the goals it has already outlined for itself, it would have to reoccupy the entire Gaza Strip. Without doing that, Israel does not have any opportunity to do what it said it wants to do. The question is, what happens next? Because it seems to me right now, the state of Israel does not really have an answer as to what it will do after it reoccupies Gaza. And in my view, then the question is going to be whether Israel will leave it if there is no suitable arrangement available to it, if it does not come to terms with either the Palestinian Authority, Shai said, the PLO should come back. But the Israeli government for the last 15 years has done its best to make sure that that does not happen. And in fact, the Israeli Prime Minister's office just a few days ago issued a statement stating clearly this is not the policy of the current Israeli government. The current Israeli coalition will not allow the PA, the Palestinian Authority, to come back to control Gaza. This is what the Israeli government have just said. And so, obviously, and Shai mentioned an alternative to that, or something that could, in fact, be in addition to that. And that would be a contingent of Arab, of some of the Arab countries that are at peace with Israel, or those that have signed the Abraham Accords, to have a presence in Gaza that would help in enforcing law and order, and perhaps in terms of the delivery of services. I doubt very much that any of the Arab countries would want to come to control Gaza if controlling Gaza is not part and parcel of a larger arrangement regarding the entire Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And therefore, I just as I can't think of the PA, of the Palestinian Authority, returning as part of an outcome of negotiations with Israel, I think it is even more difficult to get Arab countries involved if there is no a wider package, a vision, a plan, a roadmap that addresses the larger issue of the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So what will be the default outcome in this case? Israel will be in occupation of Gaza. Israel will return to govern Gaza. Israel will be the party that sets the rules, and that would be the only way for Israel to be able to achieve its goals of this war. Unless Israel changes these goals, then the only outcome that I can conceive as realistic, this is not the desirable, I think, for most Israelis. This is not the desirable, certainly for the Palestinians. But I think this is going to be the default outcome, given the current Israeli objectives of this war, and the objectives that Shai outlined earlier, that Hamas would be destroyed as a military force, and Hamas would be destroyed as a governing body. Right now, the only body that is interested in controlling Gaza, of all the parties that we are talking about, is Hamas. And that, in my view, will remain the case after the war ends. Hamas will be the only party. And so I'm assuming, given Israel objectives, that this is not going to be Israel's goal. Israel will not negotiate a deal with Hamas after it reoccupies the entire Gaza Strip. So this is my, therefore, prediction. I hope this is untrue, and it will not happen. But my prediction would be Israel will reoccupy the entire Gaza Strip and will stay there for a long time to come, unless there is movement on the third issue that I'll address, which is the Israeli-Palestinian issue. But before I address that, let me say a few things about the domestic environment. We're looking at a situation in which we don't know what happens to the domestic balance of power after that. In what Hamas did on October 7, there are things that the Palestinians will admire very much. That is, Hamas resort to force in order to end the siege and blockade over Gaza. This is how Palestinians, the overwhelming majority of Palestinians, will interpret what Hamas did, regardless of what the real intentions were. And I think real intentions might have been different, but that doesn't really matter. For the overwhelming majority of Palestinians, what Hamas did was use of force as an effective tool to have leverage and to force the Israelis to do things that the Israelis do not want to do. And most Palestinians today believe that Israel understands nothing but the language of force. and that all the 30 years of Oslo has not changed this Israeli mindset, and that Israel does not see the Palestinians as people who are entitled to self-determination and state of their own, and that Israel is using the Oslo process to consolidate its occupation, which is already permanent. So they will admire Hamas for that. But Palestinians have seen, and many of them have seen, although many of them are in denial right now, they've seen the atrocities that Hamas has committed. This, in my view, will eventually, the denial of that, it will eventually disappear, it will diminish at least, and that we will see more and more people seeing the behavior of Hamas regarding civilians, the death and destruction that Hamas has committed against civilians as something that is unacceptable. And that will have an impact on how Palestinians look at Hamas. So there is going to be some difficulty and some contradictions, and people will have to eventually make up their mind as to what Hamas is and whether Hamas can continue to be one of the top leaders of the Palestinian political parties. That this is going to impact the domestic balance of power. In the short term, I think it is Hamas as the defenders that will emerge, and which means that Hamas will become even more popular and stronger in Palestinian politics, both in Gaza and in the West Bank. Although I can't speak about Gaza with authority at this point, I don't have any data right now as to how people are reacting to what is currently going on, and how many of them are putting the blame on Hamas versus putting the blame on the state of Israel that is currently bombarding Gaza and killing all these women and children and in the Gaza Strip who are dying by the hundreds every day. So that is certainly going to help protect Hamas, shield Hamas from criticism. The question is going to be also with regard to who leads the Palestinians. Mahmoud Abbas enters this situation, October 7, with absolutely no popularity, no legitimacy, and that's certainly going to have a dramatic impact on his ability to have control over Gaza if conditions do allow, without having legitimacy, renewing his legitimacy. And that seems to be highly unlikely, if not impossible right now. Attitudes of Palestinians will certainly, the issue of militancy will also be affected in the short term. I think there will be greater militancy in Palestinian society. This is not just because of what Hamas did or what is currently happening in Gaza, but also for what is currently happening in the West Bank. And that is the settler violence and terrorism throughout the West Bank that is currently leading to significant rise in this militancy among Palestinians and support for violence, which will translate into support for armed groups and to greater violent interaction between Palestinians and Israelis. The Israeli-Palestinian issue, I realize I'll have to speed things up. On the Israeli-Palestinian issue, I think there are various issues here that we need to look at. Let me start with what Shai mentioned earlier. As Israel was making deals with the Arab countries, the Abraham Accords deals, I think many Israelis, and we've seen this in our joint Israeli-Palestinian surveys, since the start of this Arab normalization, we have seen significant hardening of attitudes among Israeli Jews with regard to the two-state solution and compromise with the Palestinians. And even much more militancy that we have seen in previous surveys. Our joint Israeli-Palestinian surveys go back to 2000. So for 23 years, we have data on this. In more recent years, we have been collecting data jointly with our Israeli colleagues on issues of compromise and willingness to accept compromise and so on. And clearly, the situation as we moved since the Abraham Accords forward, we are beginning to see Israelis basically saying, why should we compromise if we can have the fruits of peace without having to make any compromises to the Palestinians? So hardening of attitudes and militancy among Israeli Jews has been on the rise. this is something that I think many Israelis will have to rethink about. And I think Shai is right, ignoring the Palestinian issue, thinking that that Arab normalization is going to bring peace to the region or to Israeli-Arab relations, and that the Palestinians will have to somehow adjust, has now proven to be totally misguided. And there is absolutely no doubt that Israelis will have to consider what will happen to the Israeli-Palestinian relations. Under current conditions, I'm afraid attitudes will even become worse in terms of militancy and in terms of hardening of attitudes regarding conflict resolution. But I think as the Israelis, just as Palestinians will gradually come to terms with the atrocities and the violence that Hamas has committed, the Israelis will have to come to terms with the issue of how to organize their relationship with the Palestinians. It is not going to come immediately, but I think in the midterm, this is one of the things that will probably begin to change. You cannot ignore the Palestinian issue, thinking that Arab normalization is the answer and that it will bring peace. I think marrying the two is going to be something that promises to be a lot more successful. In terms of the relationship between the Palestinian Authority and the State of Israel, this is going to be the second most important issue in the wake of all of this. And one of the areas that there is absolutely no doubt that the Palestinian Authority and Israel today coordinate all kinds of activities together, including security coordination. The question is going to be what will happen to all of that. There will be tremendous pressure on the Palestinian Authority to seize all kinds of coordination with Israel. Under the current Palestinian leadership, I don't see that happening, but it is not clear for how long the current Palestinian leadership, with its status diminishing day by day, to what extent it can maintain it and prevent a total clash between the Palestinian Authority, including its security services, and the Israelis, including the Israeli army. And if we see an open clash, this will obviously lead to the explosion, an explosion in the West Bank, not one similar to the Second Intifada, but one that involves use of force by the Israelis against the Palestinian security services, and that will certainly essentially mean putting an end to the only security sector in the West Bank that is currently able to control it and maintain some level of stability. It is eroding day by day, but this erosion could become much worse again. This is a speculation, assuming that the current Palestinian leadership isn't going to come with any initiative that would renew its legitimacy, or that the State of Israel will not be reaching out to the Palestinian Authority, trying to improve relations, thereby improving the standing of the Palestinian Authority. The prospect for peace alongside the two-state solution, how is that going to be impacted, is going to be my last word here. I think given the current Israeli government, I just don't see that happening. If there is a change in the makeup of the Israeli government, something that brings the center into focus, and the center in Israel is able to make decisions without having to defer to the right wing in Israel, and if we are, and that is certainly going to be an extremely critical need to revive any Israeli-Palestinian negotiation, there will have to be a need for the U.S. administration then to provide a vision and a roadmap for how this will unfold. The fact that the U.S. administration has so far failed in that test of leadership, despite the gravity of the situation, the U.S. administration has not come out with any vision as to how it sees this larger picture, not just what happens after the war in Gaza, but the larger issue of Israeli-Palestinian peace and even the Arab-Israeli peace, that is the normalization process that is currently underway, and how to marry that with the Israeli-Palestinian peace, and how out of all of that we can then begin to consider how to organize Gaza after this is all over. That kind of vision, only the U.S. can provide. The region alone is not going to be able to provide it. The Palestinians and Israelis alone are not going to provide it. And that is currently missing. If it continues to be missed for a longer period of time, we will get into a situation in which no one is going to be leading. There will be no vision. The Israeli-Palestinian relation peacemaking along the lines of a two-state solution, for example, will certainly not be, is one of those things that will receive a significant blow as a result of this war. And I'll end here.
Thanks, Khalil. I'll get my picture up as well here. I guess it won't let me put myself up, so you're all, so much the better.
We can do. We can
you
see.
can hear me, right? Yeah, but I think the host is changing around. You will sadly, I think, be able to see me. Too bad. So there's really a lot to think about here. I'm going to just put a couple of questions on the table. You can respond to them as much as you want. To some extent, Khalil, you've already responded a bit to Shai, so Shai, you may have some response you want to give. First question is not about the day after, but about the present situation. And I think people are horrified by the violence on both sides. I mean, you both know this, you both mentioned it. But I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and then if I'm right, you can tell me what the implications might be, that even though a very credible case can be made that each side has violated international law, and that pretty much the facts bear that out without a lot of debate being necessary. But each side, I think, feels, and here I'm talking about the general public on both sides, think that, well, this is necessary, it's justified, look what the other side did, what else would you have us do? And I think Palestinians can make that case as well. Certainly Israelis can make the case. So how should we think about this? That's about what I think a lot of people are thinking about right now as we watch TV and we see the discussions with Israelis who have been victims of this. What do we do with the idea that that both sides have the view, for reasons that aren't really hard to understand, that they have to do something, that not doing something would be unacceptable, and that if that involves killing civilians, well, it's unfortunate, but so be it. If you think you could say something about that, I think people would be interested. The main question I want to talk about is the one that you've both been discussing about what comes after and what prospects there might be for some sort of an accommodation. I think you both sound pretty pessimistic, except in the very long run, when there's just a question mark about what will happen. And I am. Khalil, you've kind of answered this, so if you don't have too much more to add, it's okay, but I want to emphasize that. So if we're asking the Arab countries, I don't know, Bahrain and the Emirates and Morocco, to kind of take care, help manage what goes on in Gaza, I can't see that that's going to be acceptable from a Palestinian point of view. It isn't necessarily clear what the alternative would be, but from the Palestinian point of view, it seems to me, and you can tell me if I got this right, that the problem has been that there hasn't really been any interest in working with Palestinians. And so for a long time, until Hamas's action, the view was, well, we're going to connect, Israel's going to connect with Saudi Arabia pretty soon, and that will finish things. And now we don't have to worry about the Palestinians. So it seems to me that that's not a very practical solution, but perhaps I'm wrong, or perhaps Shai wants to defend it a little bit more. In any event, I guess my main question is, and I know you've kind of commented on this a bit, to what extent can we expect Palestinians, I'm going to ask Shai a similar question for Israel, can we expect Palestinians to really have confidence in any kind of a peace process and be willing to go down that channel? Responsibly, well, what's the alternative? And the alternative, and the answer to that is, well, Hamas was the alternative. Well, that doesn't lead anywhere constructive. But what would be acceptable to the Palestinians? Greater participation in Arab states, something very different on the Israeli side? Is there any possibility of that? So your comments pertain to this somewhat, but maybe you want to add a bit. To Shai, it's sort of a similar question. I've done some work with Israeli National Election Study data, going back to the election of 2003, and then the following election that Sharon won in 2006. It seems to me that Israelis, and again, this is something for you to respond to. You can tell me that I've got it wrong, but the data show, I think, that decline in support for territorial compromise went down during this period, but not nearly as much as went down the idea that we should negotiate with the Palestinians to try to reach an agreement. Well, who then should we negotiate with if you are in favor of territorial compromise, or at least you're open to hearing what it might involve? And I think that the Israeli public has had pretty much, well, I'll finish the thought. You're going to perhaps disagree, and that will be constructive. That'll be fine. A kind of distorted view of the Palestinians. Go back to Camp David in 2000 and why an agreement wasn't reached. The story that Israelis were told, and the Americans helped them to tell the story, was a wonderful offer was made. The Palestinians said no, and we know they're not serious. From there we had the Intifada. Where'd that come from? Oh, Arafat had planned it long in advance. He was waiting for this. Never mind that it started with the Temple Mount and other things. And the Mitchell report says, no, it wasn't planned in advance, and says that maybe it wouldn't have had the second Intifada look like it ended up looking had it not been for the overreaction, quote unquote, of the IDF. I don't want to go through all this, and maybe any individual one we could argue that that's not quite the right conclusion. But it seems to me the Israelis have they don't see anybody to talk to in the Palestinians, and even if we manage to find a leader who's willing to talk and is interested in compromise, ordinary Palestinians will never go along with it. I mean, this is the question: is that the general Palestinian view? So if this is accurate to at least some degree, I think part of the problem is that I mean, there are a lot of different parts of the problem, but one part of the problem is that Israelis have formed an opinion about the Palestinians, which is, at least in some important respects, not based on an accurate assessment. I'll stop there. I don't want to take. I've already maybe taken up a bit too much time. Shai, why don't I ask you to go first? Actually, I'll ask Khalil. Maybe you'll go first. I'll give Shai the last word, and then we'll go to the chat.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. With regard to your first issue, I think that is a very, very serious issue, a very serious problem, that on both societies there is willingness to justify the worst kind of violence against the other side, targeting civilians, maiming women and children, taking civilians hostages, and all of that is being justified by the behavior of the other side. And that is absolutely true. This is happening. And unfortunately, I just don't see how that will end anytime, as long as the two sides interact violently with each other in the absence of any ongoing diplomatic process that has viability and that promises to provide both sides with means other than force to achieve their goals. For Palestinians, ending the Israeli occupation, building their own state, living in liberty and freedom and sovereignty is a fundamental goal that will not be given up at all. And if they, as they are now, come to the conclusion that diplomacy and negotiations are not viable, that there is really no one willing to put any kind of pressure on Israel to respect international law, to end its occupation, and so on, that we are left with nothing but the use of force. And this is a very serious problem. The use of extreme violence targeting civilians is something that I can't see ending anytime soon, because both sides are currently, in fact, enforcing this idea that we need to use force, no matter how extreme it is, in order to punish the other side, in order to teach them a lesson. And of course, we see that on a daily basis today, just as we saw it on October 7th. I don't have an answer to how we need to deal with that, other than to eradicate entirely this idea that this conflict can be resolved by violence or force, and that there is an alternative approach to achieve the goals of the two sides, and that is diplomacy and negotiations. If we do not restore that, there were days in which, in the last 30 years, in which the majority of Israeli Jews and Palestinians have come to terms with diplomacy and negotiations and saw it as the only way to resolve a conflict. We have lost that moment. We need to restore that moment. Without restoring it, I'm afraid what we have seen in the last 3 weeks is something that we will continue to see, perhaps not in extreme forms as we are currently seeing it. But I just don't see how we will get out of this cycle of violence without that diplomatic alternative. With regard to the regional issue that you've asked about, Mark, the Arab countries will be very, very happy to provide support in service delivery, humanitarian assistance, reconstruction, and all of that. But they will not be willing to have their own soldiers or their own administrators setting the rules for Gazans. That isn't going to happen. I think this is just a fantasy that Arab countries would want to do that when there is a Palestinian Authority. They will say to the Israelis, they have their own authority. Why should we be the one to do that? And even if they are willing to do that, if let's assume that the Bahrainis or the Egyptians or Jordanians are willing to do that, are they going to say we will do it and enter an open-ended process which they can see no exit strategy? Of course not. They will condition that on a full understanding of how it ends, what kind of process. And they will insist on a two-state solution and the ending of occupation and the reunification of the West Bank and Gaza. The question then is the Israeli government ready for that? If the Israeli government is ready for that, then it will be ready for a simpler solution, which is to reunify the West Bank and Gaza under the Palestinian Authority. So the regional approach, while certainly can be helpful, very helpful in the day after, in my view, is alone, a regional approach alone, just inviting these countries and they will come in and replace the Israeli tanks. This is absolutely, in my view, unrealistic.
Thank you. Shai, the floor is yours.
You know, I was going over my notes carefully to see if I could disagree with Khalil about something. But I found something small to disagree with him. So I think that we are a little bit talking past each other because it really depends on whether we're talking about the short range or the longer range. Because, Khalil, for example, said that whatever, the general, put it this way, the general optimistic picture that I portrayed as an alternative, we have to remember, number one, he said that a deal to be even remotely acceptable to the PLO and to others can't be a deal about Gaza, period. It has to be a comprehensive deal that is about Israeli-Palestinian relations, which includes the West Bank, and I would assume it includes the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And I completely agree with him. And this is why I'm saying that the reckoning that I see is a comprehensive reckoning. All the assumptions that led Israel in the last 15 years would have to be re-examined, and I think they would have to be tossed, and they would have to be replaced. And the second thing is the reckoning as far as the leaderships are concerned. I'm usually trying to talk about Israel and kind of makes my Israeli colleagues a little bit uneasy because it's as if I put all the onus on the Israeli side. But what I'm going to say now applies to the Palestinian side. Look, the two leaderships, the Palestinian leadership, the existing Palestinian leadership, and the existing Israeli leadership, are irrelevant for the next world. These leaderships have to go. And just as, again, the Israeli leadership was tossed out after the 73 surprise, most of the Israeli leadership was even tossed out after the Second Lebanon War. Because, Olmert, he stayed in power for another year and a half, but he was finished by the war. And the entire leadership of the IDF was sacked and so on. So I think that, so I accept everything that Khalil said about this. It's part of what I believe, that it requires a comprehensive reckoning, which is the reason why I'm not talking about the next few weeks. And I'm probably not talking about the next few months. I think I can't say whether it's going to be 6 months or 8 months or maybe 2 years. But I think both sides would have to undergo a major reckoning. So that's number one. From here, I will say this. The second point I would like to make is this is a horrible, horrible, horrible situation. And I don't see that anyone has any good options. And I think that all the leaderships, including the Arab leaderships, the Arab state leaderships, I accept all these skepticism about what they will do, and particularly about what they will refuse to do. But they also don't face very, very good options. And as much as, for example, involvement in Gaza has a lot of risks, particularly for the Egyptians because it's next door. There are also very major risks involved in just if the alternative is what Khalil described at the end of his response, that's basically anarchy and chaos. And that means, and it's not chaos in Syria or chaos even in Libya, although Libya is a neighbor. But Libya is Libya and Egypt is Egypt. And there is a relationship between Hamas and the Muslim Brothers in Egypt. So for Egyptians, for Egypt not to get involved, yes, involved with the PA. The region is not an alternative to the Palestinians, and it's not an alternative to the PA. It has to be, or the PLO. It has to be with the PA. It has to be with the PLO. But again, I say, you look at any one of these leaders and not rolling up their sleeves also involves some major risks. Third point is about is Mark in direct response to what you said about the Israeli electorate. Look, you began in 2003. 2003 was basically after, I'm talking about the latest studies that you described. 2003 was after the second Intifada killed the Israeli left and it killed the Israeli center. And basically, this, in my analysis of the Israeli, right-wing turn in these 20 years was the result of the fact that the right wing didn't become stronger. It became stronger by default because it was tolerated by the completely disappointed left that banked on Oslo and the center that went home. Basically, it went home. Now, the catastrophe of 3.5 weeks ago was preceded by 10 weeks of demonstrations on a different issue. But those demonstrations, if I had to, summarize in one sentence, what the pre-October 7, 10 months mean, the most important thing they mean for me is that the Israeli center has woken up and it's not going home. It's the same protesters have become the first responders in the South to save the kibbutzim and the moshavim and so on and so forth. 15,000 of their volunteers are deployed now, day after day, hour by hour, to already begin some reconstruction of the settlements. But these are 15,000 represent 250,000 Israelis that were out in the street Saturday after Saturday after Saturday. So this is all part of a bigger reckoning, and we have to take that into account. What you've described is accurate, but I think it's taken over. It's dated by these two developments: the experience of the last 10 months, and also the effects of what happened. My last point about Khalil is, and this is the tiny issue in which I take issue with him. I don't think that only the United States can come up with a plan, because we have to remember that the Arab Peace Initiative was adopted precisely because no one else came with a plan, and the Saudis stepped in and said, okay, so if we have no choice, we'll come up with a plan, and here's our paragraph. And then there was a debate of over 6 weeks, and that resulted in the Arab League decisions in Beirut, and we had a plan. Okay, now something happened along the line, which is 20 years later, the Arab states gave up on the Palestinians. And the result of that was the Abraham Accords that dropped all the conditionalities of the Arab Peace Initiative. Okay, now everybody has to rethink. But I think that I was actually quite impressed with the OBS, the Saudi Crown Prince interview to Fox News. I think he's thinking about these issues, and I think that there are enough. Again, there are stakeholders here. The Jordanians are a stakeholder. The Egyptians are a stakeholder. I don't think that only the U.S. can come up with a plan.
Let's turn to Ryan, who's been monitoring the chat, and we'll put in a few questions from them or some comments.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you both, all three of you, for your remarks and your responses. We have a number of questions in the chat. The first one, I'll go in order that I received them, from Abdul Ansari. Some people have said that the two-state solution is over. Wherever we go from here, post-bellum, the two-state idea is no longer viable or desirable to parties involved. What do you think of that? Is it or isn't it? So about the two-state solution, a little bit more on sort of the prospects for that moving forward. We have a few to go through. So we'll get more done. And I guess let's just go back and forth. Professor Shikaki, you can go first.
Sure. The two-state solution has received a very, very serious blow, in fact, in the last decade, and it continues, and this war certainly could add further blows to that. Nonetheless, nobody has a better alternative, and this is the only alternative where we still see commitment on the part of a significant number of Palestinians, Israelis, the international community, the region. And therefore, it seems to me, if one is to look at all the options available, this is the only one that is currently more viable than the others. It doesn't mean it is viable, but it is the more viable than all the others. And we have to stick to that to test, to see whether this is doable. In my view, it remains doable if we see a willingness on the part of the State of Israel and the leadership, as well as on the part of the Palestinian leadership as well, to accept the kind of compromises that have been in the discussion since the Clinton parameters. And I think while we don't have the two publics with us right now on that, change a positive change on the ground can begin to address this issue of public opinion and whether the public would be willing to support it. I think if people see that this is indeed remains a viable option, they will change their mind and support it. This is based on the research, the survey research. We see among both sides, Israeli Jews and Palestinians, a significant number of people who have turned away against this two-state solution, not because they don't like it, but because they think it is no longer viable. Increasing its viability, making it look more realistic than it looks in their eyes right now, would be the key to ensuring that there is a majority of the Palestinian public that would support the required concessions to make this happen. The Israeli government today is the main impediment to that. I'm not underestimating the impediments on the Palestinian side about it. They are very, very serious. Nonetheless, I think when you have a coalition of Israelis, religious Zionism and extreme right-wingers and the kind of Netanyahu leadership we currently see, I see that as a much more serious impediment than to have Abbas, a weak leader who lacks legitimacy and acceptance from his own people. I see the Israeli side of things on this issue to be the main impediment, and I do think that regional and international leadership on this right now therefore becomes critical, and that I see no alternative to the U.S. leadership. I agree with Shai that the region can be very helpful, and it is trying and has been trying. I don't think that the Abraham Accords are because the Arabs are giving up on the Palestinians. I think they are giving up on Palestinians and Israelis coming to terms, and that they are therefore pursuing their interests. I don't think this is just a Palestinian issue, but rather the interaction between the two sides. But we see what happened to the Arab Peace Initiative. It failed. And that is going to be the same if the Arabs are to come up today with a vision of how to resolve this conflict. In my view, there is zero chance that it will succeed unless we are able to bring Israel on board. And Israel right now is not on board. If we see leadership from the part of the U.S. and willingness to use leverage to encourage both sides to move forward, that I think would be perhaps the most effective, if not the only, means of pushing forward towards a two-state solution.
Thank you, Professor Feldman.
Well, I would be quick because I agree with 95% of what Khalil said. 95%. I think the issue of like who's more responsible, whether the impediments are slightly more on the Israeli side or slightly more on the Palestinian side, are really quite in some ways it's quite beside the point. And the fact that that the Arab Peace Initiative failed, of course it failed. But when Sadat went to Israel, and then the Camp David of '78 and the peace treaty of 1979, he was rejected by the entire Arab world, and the entire Arab world made a decision to take the Arab League offices away from Cairo and relocate them somewhere else because and Egypt was ostracized because of that. But then gradually there was the Fahd plan, and gradually. And so on and so forth, all the way to, and then in Madrid, what was Madrid? And Madrid was an affirmation that the Egyptian policy or approach was the correct one. The Arab world came around to Egypt, not Egypt to the Arab world. So so the API failed, and and the region suffered for that in the last 20 years. But either we have some hope that there is something called the learning curve, or we give up. And I still refuse to give up.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions I'm going to blend together for the sake of time, since I think they're relatively similar. So there's quite a few questions about the two-state solution. And in particular, one asks for data, if there's any current data about support for a two-state solution on among any of the parties, Israel or in Gaza or in the West Bank. Another has a comment about the viability of a one-state solution with equal rights for all religions and ethnicities. And I think a third question related to this, I think, is a kind of a more general question. In a globalized, highly connected, mobile world where national boundaries seem to be withering faster than ever, is the nation state still a relevant lens for long-term vision and prosperity for both Israelis and Palestinians? So maybe another question about this, if you have data on the two-state solution, sort of support for that idea, or contrarily, the idea of a one-state solution, which we hear maybe less about in terms of actual data for supporting that idea as a solution. rather than maybe, a long-term sort of kick the can down the road strategy? And then is this even the conversation that we should be having? National boundaries or states? So I guess we'll go in opposite order this time. Professor Feldman, if you want to say anything
No,
first.
I think no, because Khalil is the one, he's the data man.
I'm happy to start with the data issue. Our latest joint Israeli-Palestinian survey was published early this year, and it did show that among Israeli Jews and Palestinians, the level of support for the two-state solution continues to be in decline, significant decline, in fact, and that we are just looking at a third or less of Israeli Jews and Palestinians continuing to support that idea. However, I think only Israeli Arabs, by the way, the Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel, this is the only group that continues to support the two-state solution wholeheartedly with large percentages. Israeli Jews and Palestinians no longer do that. There was a time, 10 years ago, we could find a significant majority on both sides willing, among Israeli Jews and Palestinians, willing to support that idea of a two-state solution. It would be, therefore, a mistake to just focus on this still photo. Every time we do a survey, we take a still photo of public opinion. We need to see the dynamic involved. We need to see what is driving that. And what is driving that, to a large extent, is how people read the reality on the ground, how they see the issue of feasibility. And this is where the problem is. If we are able to increase the viability perception among Palestinians and Israeli Jews, this seems to be, to me, the key, therefore, to reverse what we currently see in terms of hardening of attitudes regarding the issue of a two-state solution. The support for the one-state solution is much higher. So while the support for the two-state solution is almost equal, and they say, and the dynamic affecting it on Israeli Jews and Palestinians is identical. The issue of the one-state solution is very different. This is where the support is entirely on the Palestinian side. Israeli Jews do not support a one-state solution with equal rights for Palestinians. Israeli Jews want a state for Jews. They want a state that has a majority of Israeli Jews. And they don't, so the demographic issue, the Jewish character of the State of Israel as a Jewish state, is something that is of extreme value for Israeli Jews. And they are not willing to give up on that. And so the idea of a state with equal rights is unacceptable to Jews, Israeli Jews, but it is an idea that is acceptable to Palestinians. It's not, there is no majority in favor, and no Palestinian political party has endorsed it. Not a single Palestinian leader has been willing to publicly promote it. We see most of the strength in support for that coming from young Palestinians. You mentioned a question about the nation state and whether the nation state is still there. For Palestinian youth, this is where we actually see the questioning of this idea of a nation state and nationalism and state based on national identity. We see young Palestinians questioning that, young Palestinians focusing on rights, having equal socio-economic and political rights is where young Palestinians are. This is where you can find a third or even up to 40% of youth, 18 to 29, who remain, who have gradually been increasing in numbers and who think a one-state solution with equal rights is the best way to go forward. I must again say that even for this group that supports the one-state solution, if you make the two-state solution more viable, and if we ensure that the future Palestinian state will be democratic, the support for the one-state solution almost completely vanishes among the Palestinians. That's why I think we should have more confidence in the two-state solution in terms of public support than in the one-state solution with equal rights. I don't see any problem with the one-state solution with equal rights. I do not think that it is problematic for me personally or for Palestinians. But I just don't see that as a solution when I compare it to a two-state solution, which is a lot more acceptable to Israeli Jews and to a large number of Palestinians.
I agree. Next question.
Great. So a couple more questions. Let's just take a slightly different tack to ask. One has to do with kind of there are a couple of questions about the scale of violence right now, and one has to do with the viability of a humanitarian pause if it looks like it's likely, and another on the same sort of tack about sort of what to do in the current situation. Hamas's attack was barbaric. Israel's bombardment seems barbaric. U.S. Using U.S. weapons is barbaric. The Biden administration is sort of caught between all of this and wants to send more weapons. What do you suggest the U.S. should or could do to stop any of this, the current killing? And I think related to this, so I'll fold in one more question, which is the economic incentives at play fueling this, such as oil prices, arms prices, technology investment, and things like that. So the viability of actually humanitarian stopping or a pause or whatever, as opposed to all of these other interests and kind of U.S. strategy getting involved.
You know, the real problem. So we are. I don't think that there is any disagreement here that what we're witnessing on the ground, and we have been witnessing on the ground from October 7 and to this very day, and probably will continue to see in the next weeks to come, are horrific types of violence. There are all kinds of different violence. There's a difference between butchering somebody with a knife and dropping a bomb from 20,000 feet, but it's actually these are meaningless distinctions. There is, of course, a distinction between but I'm not even going to get into this issue that Mark seemed to have touched upon, which is which of the narratives seems to be more accurate and so on. I'm not even going to get into that. The issue, you see, with all these proposed or all these objections to what is happening on the ground now is that nobody has actually come up with any acceptable proposal, alternative. What is Israel supposed to do? If you're pointing, if the arrow is pointed to Israel, what is Israel supposed to do? Do you want to begin to speculate about what would have been the dimensions of the American reaction in the case that a terrorist group infiltrated from Toronto to Buffalo, New York, and butchered 1,400 people in Buffalo, New York? What kind of devastation you would see? So again, this is not to justify. It just says this is human nature, and humans respond. And the thing is, in the present environment, no one has come up with an alternative. An alternative that is a real alternative, that is minimally acceptable, because it's not a minimally acceptable proposition to say, well, Israel, why don't you just stop everything you're doing, and then what? Then we have Hamas establishing itself after these horrific acts. As I said earlier, they're still even in the northern part of let alone what's in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. Can you expect anyone in the region where I lived for 3 years that has been basically completely evacuated or almost completely evacuated? The college that I headed is neighboring the town of Sderot. The town of Sderot had a population of 30,000 people. There's hardly 3,000 people left there. Can you expect any one of these to come back to live to their own homes in a situation where you can't have even a minimal type of guarantee of their personal safety? So, it's all fine to say, oh, this is horrible, this is terrible, this is horrible, this is terrible, and so on and so forth. but as a recipe for what can be done in the next weeks and so on and so forth, I have not seen anybody present any kind of an acceptable alternative. Again, if we talk about what will happen 3 months from now, 6 months from now, 8 months from now, 2 years from now, when we will have time to make to see, and the parties will have time to see the implementation of the bigger changes that Khalil and I mentioned, that's a different story. But in the immediate, I don't see anybody having come with any kind of reasonable alternative to what is happening right now. Unfortunately, it's very, 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 very sad. But I haven't seen it, and unless I tuned myself out to the media or whatever. No, I don't think so. I don't think anybody has come up with any real alternative.
I do want to say something about this as well. Shai have, of course, been the president of Szpiech College, and so he knows the people there and their families, and this is a personal knowledge, and so personally he is invested in that. This is true for me as well. I have 75 researchers who work with me, and I'm on daily contact with them. I have 4 sisters and a brother who live there, and I'm in daily contact with them. And I can tell you that the suffering is huge. And these people, when I ask them, what is it that they want the war to do? And they just want a ceasefire. They want the bloodshed to stop. And they want access to water, electricity, and so on. This is their basic demands right now, and we need to do that. If we can't get a ceasefire, then the state of Israel must stop bombarding civilians. When 70% of people who are dying are women and children, we know that this war is essentially targeting civilians, and that has to stop, even if the violence doesn't stop. But the targeting of women and children must stop, and the international community must put all kinds of pressure on Israel to stop doing that to civilians. Ideally, of course, I do want a ceasefire, and I do want negotiations, and I do hope that at one point we will be getting to that. For now, I'm afraid I just don't see any serious pressure on the state of Israel to stop the targeting of the civilians. And I, therefore, don't know what is going to happen. The only question that I ask of our teams and my family there is to tell me whether they are alive, and nothing else. And that, I'm afraid, it tells you how our expectations have become so low. Where all we need is that the people we know are still alive, when we know that the life they're currently living is so miserable.
I agree.
I think we have, maybe if you both agree, although we're at time, room for one more question, if that would be all right. And I think I'll fold in just a couple of questions, as well as some other comments that have sort of come back in response. And essentially what I'll summarize these as saying is, what do you see the goals of each side being, and are they achievable, or have they been achieved? So has Hamas actually achieved its goal already by stirring the pot or causing this reaction, or whatever's happening, creating perhaps more sympathy for itself by provoking Israeli response through violence, or does it have a longer term goal, like a regional war, or something like that? And on the other side, do you see, or can you understand Israel's goal, and what would it take to achieve this? This might be a huge question, but I think it's an interesting one to pose, which is, what does each side want to happen? Have they achieved it, or when will they, or how could they achieve those goals? And I don't know, whoever wants to go first can go first. It might be, you can simply say, I don't know. But I think it's an interesting question to ponder. So I'll throw that in the air and see whichever would like to answer first.
I don't mind starting. I would say the following. Israel defined what I would call intermediate goals. They don't define it as intermediate goals. I define it as the intermediate goals. The intermediate goals is to, as we mentioned already, that was defined, is to eradicate Hamas's fighting and governing capacity. But this is not the goal. But the Israeli government has not articulated what its goals are beyond that. The Israeli government has not provided a vision. Neither did it do that before October 7th, during the previous 20 years. What kind of Gaza Strip does Israel want to see as its neighbor? Living, whatever. Just what is its vision for Gaza? Israel has not articulated that. It hasn't articulated that before, and it hasn't articulated it now. So, in terms of measuring achievements versus stated goals, the only thing we can, for the moment, compare is the issue of whether Israel is achieving its stated goals, which, as I said, are intermediate term at best, and we don't know. We are just in the beginning of this, unfortunately, of this horrific event. So we don't know. Now, I would venture to say Hamas hasn't achieved anything. It has not achieved anything, and it will not achieve anything unless it undergoes, again, a major, you can call it reinventing, because this goes beyond reckoning. It requires that Hamas reinvent itself. Why is that the case? Because if you look at other national movements, whether you go to Vietnam or you go to the FLN in Algeria, they articulated a goal of achieving independence, but they did not challenge the power from which it sought its independence. The FLN in Algeria did not have a claim on France, and the Viet Cong did not have a claim on the US. The problem with Hamas, as long as Hamas does not travel the journey that the PLO has, or that Fatah has, is that their claim is not on Gaza. Their claim is on Israel. And Israel is not going anywhere. Israelis are not going anywhere. Israelis have fought for more than 120 years to achieve national independence, and they're not going anywhere because anti-Semitism is not going anywhere. If anything, we see now a rekindling of anti-Semitism just in the last 48 hours in areas under Russian occupation. So as long as Hamas does not reinvent itself, rethink, and state its goals in limited terms, then it's not going to achieve anything. It won't be able to because it won't have the capacity. But in theory, even if it did 5 times or 5 different times what it did on October 7th, they would still not win because Israel is not going to go anywhere.
Thank you.
I would say that Hamas goals cannot be achieved. I agree. But that's because I define Hamas goals differently. I think Hamas goals were achievable when Hamas envisaged its offensive that started on October 7th. I think Hamas' goal was to build a mini-state in Gaza that would enter into a de facto peace with Israel that is semi-permanent, a long-term hudna or truce. That, I think, is what Hamas aimed, and the war that Hamas waged had that limited goal in mind, and it meant to gain leverage in negotiations with Israel, including taking prisoners. The military success of Hamas, let me distinguish the two things. The military success of Hamas, in my view, was not an impediment to Hamas achieving its goals. It would have made things extremely difficult, the success, that is, which I think was beyond its own expectation. It is the atrocities, the violence, the kidnapping of civilians, these horrible scenes that the Israelis saw and that everyone in the international community saw and the Palestinians saw. It is these scenes that were the undoing of the entire Hamas military capacity and the entire plan for Hamas to make Gaza it's a permanent state of its own, a mini state of sort. That goal has been destroyed by these atrocities and not by the military success that Hamas had achieved on October 7. And therefore, I disagree with Shai on the larger picture. The larger picture existed, Shai, throughout all these years. The Israeli government, the most right-wing Israeli governments, were willing to make deals with Hamas. So the fact that Hamas's charter was predicated on the destruction of the state of Israel did not prevent Netanyahu from sending $360 million every year to Hamas through Qatar. Imagine the situation. What Netanyahu now calls ISIS, he for all these years have nurtured and supported with $360 million, allowing the Qataris to pour into Hamas's budget. Now, so that goal by itself was not the undoing of Hamas. What was the undoing of Hamas has been these atrocities. The way Hamas has managed this war has been was suicidal eventually and led to what it led. And therefore, I don't see. Of course, you can give Hamas other goals if you want and say Hamas has achieved those goals. I don't think so. I think Hamas wanted a mini state in Gaza. This war was meant to give Hamas the capacity, the leverage to be able to negotiate such a deal with the state of Israel, with the Netanyahu government. And Hamas thought this was doable. And in my view, this would have been had Hamas not committed the atrocities and the kind of violence that was so rejected and unacceptable by Palestinians or Israelis. That it has been, in my view, the undoing of the entire Hamas plan.
Yeah, but accepted, Khalil. But to do this, Hamas would have had to undergo in a way that would have been, let's say, discernible to Israelis, that they have in fact changed their goals from unlimited goals to limited goals. I'm not saying that there weren't, expressions of this somewhere and so on and so forth. But in terms of the stated positions of Hamas did not go through what the PLO went through in 1988. And then you see, so to discern from the fact that as I said, because I started an hour and a half ago by saying Hamas served a purpose for Israelis that did not want a two-state solution. But between saying Hamas served the purpose and saying that the Israelis were willing to accommodate Hamas in some kind of an arrangement, that was an ocean to cross, because when again, not as far as the formal Hamas position is concerned, but when Hamas people, including Sinwar, expressed their objectives as even an intermediate objectives of for example, end the siege. End the siege means allow us to have control over exit and entry points, allow us to have a port. Well, if you think about the effects of the last 2.5 weeks, if Israelis saw in the last 2.5 weeks what Hamas was able to accumulate with Israeli and Egyptian control over the exit and entry points and without a port, now what would the Israelis say? They would say, imagine if we gave them a port. Imagine if we gave them a port.
Hamas would have accepted a port under international control, not under its control. That was the goal. The long-term hudna or truce would have given Hamas, and Israel was willing to do that. Israel was willing to allow Cyprus to provide such port facilities, but it would still remain under the supervision of an international monitor.
Well, I think we have a basis now for another Zoom conversation.
Yeah, we've just gotten warmed up here and are getting rolling, but we'll have to postpone that conversation. I really appreciate your contributions, and I want to thank all three of you. Thank you to Khalil Shikaki, thank you to Shai Feldman, and thank you, Mark Tessler, for participating in this roundtable, for your expertise, your contributions, and your thoughts and expertise on what's really a delicate situation. So it requires a lot to be here, and I'm deeply grateful to all of you and to everyone who participated. Everyone, we got as high as 97 participants, I think, at one point.
Yes.
So that's wonderful, and thank you for all of the questions and comments. I wish you all well, and I hope we can organize another event to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, good to see you.
Thank you.